Hello, all. It's Heath here, and I'm just adding this little audio recording at the beginning of this lesson to apologize, as this lesson abruptly cuts off at the end when we're doing our question and answer session. But the rest of it's all there, and we have a lot that we do cover. Before we get to that point, what happened was the internet went out at the church right in the middle, so we didn't get to say goodbye. So if it ends rather abruptly, that's the why. Now you know. Please enjoy.
Let us begin. Our series is entitled Revelation, End of the World, or Cause for Hope. And tonight we're going over the ninth class and the ninth chapter of Revelation. I've entitled this Hell Opens and Invading Armies Destroy. Brief review first, though. Last week we took a hard look at the eighth chapter of Revelation, which began the cycle of seven trumpets that follow the unsealing of seven seals. And later we'll have bowls, these bowls of coals that are dumped out. And similar to the seven seals, each trumpet is accompanied by a judgment or plague that is unleashed on the people. And in some instances, very similar plagues are indicated by the same seal. For example, when we'll get into that, in same seal corresponds to the same trumpet. For example, the fifth trumpet has we'll get to it later. Don't worry about it. But this time, however, unlike the seven seals, the violence, the death, the destruction are set at a much larger scale. So now, as we move into chapter 9 and the blowing of the fifth and sixth trumpets, wrath is unleashed upon the human race specifically. You may recall that the first four trumpets signified plagues that were unleashed on nature. So tonight we'll consider the ninth chapter of Revelation and the blowing of the fifth and sixth trumpets, and we'll consider the theological implications of these troubling images. And we'll just dive right in. Revelation 9, verse 1. And the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. So what to make of this angel or this star? On one hand, this angel comes from heaven where God dwells, so it should be an ambassador for the heavens, right? However, this angel falls down to earth, and there are other passages that will write of the descent from heaven of Satan, of the devil. Of this, Leonard Thompson writes, there is moral ambivalence to this star, for it comes from heaven, the place and source of divinity and goodness, but it falls downward, an image of moral and religious failing. And then he cites a similar occurrence in the 12th chapter of this very letter, Revelation 12th chapter, verse 9, where we see Satan, literally Satan, fall in a similar way. Biblical scholar Bryant Blunt postulates that the fallen star here is an allusion to Satan, the implication being, even when a terribly evil force is unleashed on the earth, God is still the author of these events and in control. And notice, the key is given to the fallen star, thus permitting this angel to unleash the powers of hell. So there's a troubling implication there that God is in control of these events. And I am reminded of the theology of Job. And Revelation assumes a similar theology where God, in that story, if you recall, removes protections from his servant Job, who was not deserving of the suffering. And yet it was the removing of those protections that brought about the suffering, the boils, the death of his children, and all of those things. And this was permitted to glorify God in a larger sense, to teach us through the book of Job about God's sovereignty and control, really at Job's expense. So again, that has very deep and, for some, troubling implications. Job is a rich book that helps us delve into questions of God's goodness. So, and that's a similar thing here. And in this case, this angel comes down under the guidance of God, and with the permission of God, unlocks a tunnel to hell. We read, he opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke, like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. So here we have more stock apocalyptic imagery. It almost washes over me at this point. Smoke, fire, darkened sun. You don't hardly know if you're reading the 24th chapter of Matthew or the book of Revelation. Textbook apocalyptic imagery. One is reminded of the smoke and fire that Moses saw at Mount Sinai, or the apocalyptic language of Jesus in certain passages. And I cited Matthew 25, 24, 25, Luke 21, Mark 13. Smoke pours out from the shaft of the underworld. Now, smoke in Revelation chapter 8, you may recall, symbolized the prayers of the saints, but now it symbolizes judgment. Of this, Leonard Thompson writes, the bottomless pit, or abyss, is rich in associations. It may indicate something general, like the unfathomable. And I'm not going to read the sources that he cites. I'm going to just trust him. These are sources from antiquity. Here's someone named Dionysius of Halicarnassus. So I'm not going to read the other ones. So it could mean something unfathomable, just an unfathomable depth, or a chasm, like a little geographical occurrence, a big hole, gap in the ground. Or it might be the site of chaos, or the primal waters from which the created order came. Similar language is used to describe, even in the Bible, of the primal waters over which God hovered, the chaos. But in broad strokes, the abyss represents the underworld, where the dead dwell. So all of those allusions I named are playing in the background, but also it's just straight up Hades, where demons and all evil will be imprisoned. The abyss is synonymous with the concept of Hades and is the realm of suffering and death. And here are cited several other places where the similar place is cited in the scriptures. Isaiah 24, verses 21 through 22 says that God will punish angels and evil kings, and they, quoting, will be gathered together as prisoners in the pit and will be confined in prison, and after many days be punished. The abyss is a bad place. The eschatological vision of it's the eschatological or end times version of a maximum security prison. It is home to the worst cosmic offenders. And knowing this, God still gives this angel the key. So the theological claims here, God holds the key to hell and is in control, even over the forces of evil. We'll discuss this later. So hold on to that. But also, God will use the destructive forces of evil as a tool to bring about the restoration of the world. We have in a larger scale here, a cosmic scale, a repetition of something similar that happened in the book of Exodus, where God used the hubris and the stubbornness of Pharaoh to his detriment in a calculated way. And the theology of the book of Job, as previously described, is very much in play here, that God will use the evil that is in the world in ways that turn it on its head. But then there's these locusts. Wait, are these locusts? Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given authority like the authority of scorpions of the earth. So here we have an army of demons unleashed on the earth. It's important to note that these metaphorical imagery to describe demons coming out of this chasm that has been opened up in the ground, hell-bent on destruction. Locusts were one of the plagues wrought upon Egypt in Exodus. However, these rather unusual, I'll put it in quotes, locusts, sting rather than bite. Or rather, sting rather than bite. One wonders if they're being referred to as locusts here is primarily to continue to build on the allusions to the plagues against Egypt, for they don't really resemble real locusts. And I've included this somewhat comical, but quite literal graphic or image. And I'm going to tell you where I got these graphics at the end of the lesson. And I'm not going to use them every time because it can be a bit distracting. But here, the entire book of Revelation is laid out in these sort of graphic forms. And I mean, it's absurd if you look at it, right? These creatures wearing crowns, we'll get to later the description, these big teeth, you've never seen locust, I guarantee, with fangs like a lion. Now we're going to jump ahead to the appearance now. We're going to skip verses 4 through 6 and come back to them, which have to do with what these locusts actually did. And we're going to focus on the descriptor, then go back, because I think that helps in picturing what's happening here. We're going to jump to verse 7. In appearance, the locusts were like horses equipped for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like woman's hair, and their teeth like lion's teeth. Now the description of these locusts is really going off the rails. Here is a good time to remind us that these are visions meant to convey meaning metaphorically. These are not meant to be taken as descriptions of literal beasts. Rather, they are trying to capture the fury and violence of hell, a violence that God has largely kept at bay until God allowed it to be unleashed. Each descriptor amplifies the terror. They come as war horses, great, mighty, and terrible. They wear crowns. Forgive the typo there, but they wear crowns in a sick pantomime of the elders near the throne of God in Revelation chapter 4. You might remember those 24 elders casting down their golden crowns. And here, from the pit of hell, come a pantomime of those elders. And while the 24 elders cast down their crowns in honor of the one ensconced on the throne, these vicious demons wear theirs proudly. Their faces are human-like, a parody of God's image, for humans are made in the image of God. It is not clear what to make of the fact that they sport women's hair. This could be to paint them as wild and unruly, or perhaps to be another reference to Rome's mortal enemies, the Parthians, who were said to have long flowing hair while they shot arrows off the backs of their horses. And then there's the teeth, again, layers upon layers of horrors, horror upon horrors. It's trying to describe a truly grotesque, terrifying being. And it goes on to describe that they had scales like iron breastplates, which I don't really see reflected in this graphic. And the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. More stock apocalyptic imagery, actually, in terms of sound, often rushing waters and loud noises accompany these great events. Verse 10, they have tails like scorpions with stingers, and their tails is their power to harm people for 5 months. So again, this image is meant to cultivate abject terror in the minds of the reader, as images of hell opening up and demonic creatures rushing out naturally should. Biblical commentators are quick to point out how much of what is described here draws from the imagery found in Joel chapter 2. You might read about it later, where a gargantuan army is released upon the earth amidst fire, smoke, darkness, and a cacophony of noise. Why 5 months? It's a very specific detail, and I wish I could say more, but it might reflect the average lifespan of a locust. Most every commentary I read and mentioned that as a possibility. However, we're not sure. But the point seems to be that this will occur for a finite period, and that's what you really need to take from it. Why 5 months? We're not sure. Now we'll go back to verse 4 and read through verse 6 to read about what these locusts are allowed to do. Verse 4, they were told not to damage the grass of the earth or any green growth or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. This theme of the sealed saints reemerges to remind the reader that those so sealed will be given divine protection through these travails. And it's already been talked about in the first cycle of 7, the unsealing. But here it's applied, what we learned earlier about the sealing of the saints for protection, sealed away for protection. It comes back. However, recall those saints beneath the altar of God that we read about in Revelation chapter 6 who were not sealed and were consumed by humanity's violence. They were killed. And these were those that, quoting Revelation 6:9, had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. And these slaughtered saints in that text, if you'll recall, cried out from beneath God's altar, asking to know how long the suffering of humanity would occur. And they were given no direct answer, but were dressed in white robes and told to rest until the number would be complete of both those who would endure to the end or killed in the fray. This implies that there will be both sealed and unsealed Christians experiencing this. However, furthermore, those slaughtered saints we read about in Revelation 6 correlate with the opening of the fifth seal. So you get this parallel I mentioned earlier. We have the fifth seal opened in chapter 6. Now we have the fifth trumpet blown. Both correlate with the cries of the saints crying out for justice as they bring back this theme of the seal. So that and we'll see more parallels when we get to the 7 bowls in Revelation chapter 16. Going on though, verse 5, they were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And the agony suffered was like that caused by a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. So it's just bad. All bad, as one would expect, should hell be set free to destroy. There's a theological assumption here, and the assumption is this: God holds evil at bay so that the world will not be wholly consumed by it. But occasionally, God allows these forces to have their way with us so that humanity may turn away from forces of destruction and toward the lordship of Christ. That is the theology of this letter. that is the theology of other writings in the Bible. It is not the theology of every place in the Bible, I will say. However, it is here. So if, I think one of the nice things about our disciples tradition is if we find that troubling, we can hold other interpretations. But that is what I believe is going on here. And as an aside too, I don't personally feel completely comfortable with this. But I don't want to miss the forest for the trees, because there are some points made even in this chapter that I do get behind, and we'll get to that as we go forward. Also, I point out that this has theological resonance with the creation accounts. I mentioned earlier how the pit could also allude to the chaos that was before creation, the waters that the Spirit of God hovered over, from which creation was called into order. And the pit of hell represents all of that pulled apart. The order that God had called into creation, torn apart by evil intent and evil forces, and destructive forces. And that being the idea. And here in this passage, we see that God still insists on these boundaries and will, by the end of Revelation, call back creation, a new heavens and a new earth, towards a greater order. But moving on, and here we come to the last verse about the blowing of the fifth trumpet. They have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, he is called Apollyon. So these locusts have a king who rules them, commanding them towards destruction. Abaddon and Apollyon both mean destruction. However, given all that we know from other passages in Revelation, the reader knows that this archdemon only has whatever powers God will allow. This devil does not yet realize that they are being used and their destructive efforts are being exploited in order to call all others away from Apollyon's destructive ways. Also, the Greek name Apollyon could be a reference to the Greek god Apollo. Writes Blunt of this, interestingly enough, the locust was one of Apollo's symbols. Domitian, likely the Roman emperor during the time of John's writing, and had a particular fondness for Apollo and liked to suggest that he was himself an incarnation of the deity. But now that woe has passed. This is signified by verse 12. The first woe has passed. There are still two woes to come. And here we are reminded of the warning that eagle gave at the end of chapter 8 last week. 3 woes were on their way, each directed specifically at the human race. The first is past. And now, first, I pause for questions and comments, because before we dive into all that follows next, I just threw a lot at you. We both have a lot to process, and so I wondered if there was something that any of you wanted to add and comment on. If so, just unmute yourselves. I'll give about 30 seconds. Okay, there being no comments, unless I missed somebody who didn't unmute themselves, apologies. We'll move on to the next trumpet blown. Then the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. This word picture may help the reader to contextualize the violence here released upon the human race. A voice comes from the altar, and yes, we are meant to think of this altar as an animate object, as this same altar will respond to a question later in Revelation chapter 6. So apparently in John's world and in the world of these visions, altars can talk. But remember that the slaughtered saints are also there beneath the altar, crying out to God for justice. All that transpires next in this vision is in response to the suffering of the innocent, hence a new voice from the altar. So that gives some context for what is about to come up. This violence is not arbitrary, but is in response to the cries of the saints who have been unjustly killed. So that's important to note. And now there's 4 new angels. Unlike the angels that we read about in association with the 4 winds and the 4 corners of the earth, who have some volition of their own, back in Revelation chapter 7, These are bound until the proper time. And now is that time marked by the blowing of the sixth trumpet. And they're bound specifically to this river Euphrates, which has great significance. More on that in a moment. We continue to read verse 15. So the four angels were released who had been held ready for the hour, the day, the month, and the year to kill a third of humankind. The number of the troops of Calvary was 200 million. I heard their number. So 2 million, and there's debate about how to translate this part of the Greek. It's an unfathomable number. It's the same word that I did not write down here, but the same word is used in other parts of the Bible to just describe a limitless supply. Like the translators will give no attempt to assign a numerical value to it, because the number isn't so important as just to point out the scale of this army is beyond what anyone could have envisioned. And back then, it was thought if you had an army of 50,000, maybe 100,000, your victory was near as guaranteed, because that was a mighty force. And this one makes those seem like a drop in the bucket in comparison. Now, later, during the pouring of the sixth bowl, we'll get to in over a month from now, the Euphrates is dried up, thus paving the way for marauding kings from the east. This would evoke in the minds of Roman readers invading armies, most namely the Parthians. But here we don't get the river dried up, but we do get our attention called to the Euphrates. And to note the significance, I'm going to read a lengthy quote. I couldn't put it any better than this, so I decided to just type it out. From Brian Blunt's commentary on Revelation. He writes, John's hearers and readers would have sensed the dread associated with the symbolic Euphrates, even without a premonition of the sixth bowl angel's exploits. For the Jewish people, the Euphrates River had always marked the outer geographical boundaries of their existence. And here he cites some scriptural examples. The peoples who lived beyond this boundary were unknown and feared. The prophets declared that God would use them to punish the people of Israel whenever they refused to repent from their sins. So there you have that theology I named earlier as an aside of God using the evil in the world against it for a greater purpose. But so no doubt the presence of fallen angels standing at this river rekindled thoughts of those disturbing prophecies. In the first century CE, the river played a more international role. The Euphrates marked the literal and metaphorical boundary between the Roman and Parthian empires. Now, you remember we talked about the Parthians in conjunction with the white horse of Revelation. Going on, given the history of conflict between Rome and Parthia, Parthia's ability to defeat Roman legions in key combat situations, and the unsettling legend that the disgraced Emperor Nero would one day resurrect and lead a Parthian army to destroy Rome, it is easy to understand how John's hint at a hostile force massed at the river, incited by fallen angels, would have fomented fear in the minds of his readers, of his hearers and readers. And as I mentioned earlier, you may recall how one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the white one, symbolized a pending foreign invasion. This omen envisioned something similar, but at a much larger scale. 1/3 of humanity is destroyed, but only because God has set limits to the scale of the destruction. And here, these wild war horses are described. Verse 17, and this is how I saw the horses in my vision. The riders wore breastplates the color of fire and of sapphire and of sulfur. And the heads of the horses were like lions' heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths. By these three plagues, 1/3 of humankind was killed, by the fire and smoke and sulfur coming out of the horses' mouths. So as with the description of the locusts in verses prior, this image is meant to convey terror. Only the weapons of destruction in this case are the vaporous fumes that emit from the mouths of the lion-headed horses. Fire, smoke, and sulfur remind the reader of the razing of cities and the mind-boggling destruction that war brings with it. Rome had long wrought such destruction on its surrounding neighbors. Now incomprehensible violence is released on Rome. They are being treated as they have treated others. Verse 19, for the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails. That just means that from where they cause pain. Their tails are like serpents with heads, and with them they inflict harm. So apparently, these beasts catch you coming and going. This again may be a reference to Parthian warfare, as they were known for shooting you with arrows in the front as they charged and in the back as they passed. And given what we just read about the Parthian I mean, about the Euphrates River and all that signified. I think that's very, very plausible. And the result, and here we will conclude Revelation chapter 9, starting with verse 20 here. The rest of humankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands or give up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk. And they did not repent of their murders or their sorceries or their prostitution or their thefts. Here, I'll remind us that the violence is meted out on the human race, but it is not arbitrary. The powers of evil, which humanity has long entertained, have merely been released upon those who had already leveraged their influence to compound human suffering. And the result? It doesn't work. The violence and bloodshed do not bring about repentance or the peace that is often forecast on the other side of the conflict. Instead, those who survived carry on in their evil ways. I think this graphic here really gets the spirit pretty well. There they are dancing with in the pits of hell, I suppose. Instead, those who survived carry on their evil ways, same as always. The point, violence and greed are not the way to God's realm. Even when God channels it, doesn't bring it about. Lordship under Christ will be very different than lordship under Caesar. God's purposes for allowing such violence to be released upon the earth is meant to persuade humanity to turn away from the death-dealing ways of Roman imperialism. What's more, these are word pictures meant to convey an analysis of the human race seemingly bent on its own destruction. This is not retributive violence. In the mind of John the Revelator, this violence turns out to be impotent in the end. What else will work? We'll discover the answer to this question by this letter's end. Some final thoughts. There's no getting around it. This text is a doozy. And we've got more of this coming up, by the way. I'm thankful in moments like these that Revelation does not attempt to describe possible future historic occurrences in specific detail, as so many Christians believe. I'm not expecting horse-sized locusts to arise out of a literal hole to hell to bite only humans for exactly 5 months. However, the claim that violence, even when controlled and channeled by God, will not change humanity's collective heart does ring true. However, what to make of what is for me the most troubling theological assumption of Revelation? That is, Revelation assumes that God is in complete control of these events. What's more, God is deliberately steering the ship. What could possibly be wrong with that? Well, God, in this instance, is facilitating this destruction. And of this, I want to read two more quotes from Brian Blunt's commentary on these questions, because I felt like they helped frame, from the perspective of Revelation, this theological conundrum, and give, from, again, Revelation's perspective, some plausible, some answers that I think might help us along. And first, I want to read. Let's see, I folded the page here, so I would. Here we go. First, I'll read are some concluding thoughts about what we just read. It reads, Revelation 9:13 through 21 specifically is a troubling text. Yet the combination of the liberation theme, which reverberates throughout this chapter, with the repentance theme that concludes this section, infuses the text with a hint of good news. It is good news that God hears those who have lifted their cries, as the saints did under the altar in chapter 6, and their prayers in chapter 8 upon the altars of sacrifice and incense. It is good news that God's judgment, as massively destructive as it is, even during the final preliminary stage of the sixth trumpet, intends not to destroy, but to reprove. Even at the approach of the end of time, there is still time to turn back to God and find the life that is eschatological relationship with God and the Lamb. And then another quote, Brian Blunt writes of this: it is God who decides if satanic forces are to be given the ability, the key, to open their realm and gain access to earth and the humans who inhabit it. It is God who decides when that access comes and how long it will last. It is God who decides the purpose of the destruction that access enables. In John's handling, God purposes to intervene on behalf of those who cry out for justice. And God will use the very force of evil itself to obliterate the humans, i.e., the Romans, and all who accommodate their claims of imperial lordship, who operate under evil's employ. Here is the irony. Evil will be unleashed, but evil will be made to act as God's judgment tool. The demonic bestial forces that rise up from the bottomless pit will target and destroy the very humans who do evil, satanic, beastly bidding. While both God's witnesses and those who persecute them will die in the cataclysms that ensue, only the persecutors and those who accommodate them will die forever. According to John in the book of Revelation, in what he saw. And bringing us back for comments, questions, I'll even say concerns.
Janet, are you talking? You're muted.
There we go. Interested in the 5 months and the 300 of this and the 2 million. I mean, definite numbers, and that just seems like I don't know. It seems like it's kind of hard to realize that it's a definite thing.
Well, the 2 million part is not as definite as it would seem. The 5 months is very specific, and biblical commentators aren't sure why. It could be because that's how long locusts live. The point seems to be this happens for a period of time under God's aegis, and then is brought to a finite end. And so that's where my notes on the boundaries of evil are important, to communicate to the reader that in the world where it seems like evil has no limits and no boundaries, God will not allow it to go beyond what could possibly be redemptive. But, and as far as the 2 million, I'm going to find the quote that talks about that number specifically, because it was helpful for me, and I learned something here. And there was a whole nother conversation about the two meanings of death in Revelation. There's a final death, almost an it just seems, what happens after that death is really vague and nondescript. But then there's the death that the saints die, which is not really an end, but a beginning of life. But around that place, there was here it is. Many commentators equate the term with the number 10,000. For this reason, here we go. The word is actually more accurately translated as myriad. So it says that John reports as a double 2 times myriad of myriads. And the term myriad symbolizes, as it does earlier in 5:11, a number so immense that it is incalculable. Mm-hmm. It's used in other places just to describe an incalculable number. And here it says a myriad, 2 times a myriad times a myriad. That's basically what it is. 2 times. So it's just like huge.
Lots.
Lots. Just, and it's not meant to be so specific. Say the commentators plural that I read. And it makes sense. Mm-hmm. Mind-boggling number, just this huge army.
Well, who is the audience that John wrote this for?
In the second and third chapters, the 7 churches in Asia Minor are designated as the recipients, but really Christians all throughout the Roman Empire were the intended audience, to encourage them to persevere through whatever persecution may come, and to not accommodate the ways of Rome. So Christians.
Would those early Christians have understood all the symbolism more than
Up until the
me?
second century, apocalyptic literature was well understood. And we'll get to this later in a Bible lesson that isn't about when we've moved through Revelation. We're talking more about the history of interpretations of Revelation. We're going to go through a class to just go over the ways it's been understood. And what I've learned in that research was up until around the year 200, there were enough Jews who understood apocalyptic literature that it was still being reproduced and people were writing apocalyptic writings into the first century. But when the Jewish population were expelled from Rome and Gentile Christians took over the maintenance of the synagogues, which were becoming churches, where before you might have had Jewish Jesus followers and Christian Jewish followers sharing an identity. Near and around this time, the Jews were expelled from Rome. And when that happened, the Gentiles took primary leadership, and they also began to espouse the same anti-Semitism that was rife in the Roman Empire at that time. And so in Christian communities, they lost the ability to understand apocalyptic literature because it was a Hebrew, and it was a Hebrew genre.
I believe Ezekiel has some references that are parallel to what's in Revelation.
Yes.
So like 4 or 5, I think. And so the Jewish people were more accustomed to this type of knowledge.
They knew how to read their own literature, because by this point it had been, you mentioned Ezekiel, it's centuries before Jesus, and apocalyptic literature continued to be written up into the time of Jesus, much of which is not in our canon, apocryphal Jewish writings in those centuries leading up to Jesus. And then Jesus uses them nonstop in Matthew 24 and 25 and Mark 13 and Luke 21, where he talks about the transition. It reads sort of like a revelation in microcosm, where Jesus, in describing the transition between the old age and the new age, as Revelation is trying to do, he uses just stock apocalyptic imagery because he knew as a Jewish man, he knew his audience, and that was the ways that they were used to talking. And then after the second century, there really aren't any apocalyptic writings, Hebrew apocalyptic writings, or Christian after that. And then by the time the canon was being decided in the 500s, it barely made it in, barely. And that was because many people didn't know what to make of it. So what we're doing here is trying to rediscover in modern times how to understand this book. But yeah, and John, in this book too, it was written for an audience to be understood. It wasn't written to obscure. It was written the book is called Revelation. It's meant to reveal. The unfortunate thing is it's very difficult to access 21 centuries later or 20 centuries later.
And we have to remember that this is Sodom and Gomorrah like, but when you get to the end of it, you get back there to 22, you find a whole different story.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's where it may sound strange. The numbers don't bother me because God's just a God of numbers. He told Jacob, he said, you're going to be down in Egypt for 470 years. Okay, he's done numbers all through the Bible. And so, if I remember correctly, a third of the water was destroyed along with the animals, and I think a third of the land was destroyed.
All thirds at this point.
Yeah, all thirds at this point. And I think, in my own interpretation, it's like, okay, I could try a way to say this. If today a third of Indianapolis disappeared or blew up or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
we would want to investigate. We would want to know why. We would want to know what we could do to prevent anything else from happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's like a first warning. Okay, guys, now let's straighten up, get the books out, read the Bible, get to know God, get to know Jesus. And so it's it's just a warning to them that these things are going to happen.
It's a warning to call people to away from accommodation to the destructive ways of the world into the life-giving ways of the Lordship of Jesus Christ. That's the primary, and then to encourage those who are enduring through the suffering in this world caused by people who, evil seem to run amok, that God is still in control even of those mechanisms. And it's my opinion, and this is an opinion about the interpretation. The whole enterprise doesn't rise and fall on this, but I do think that these 3 cycles of 7 are not meant to describe 3 historic occurrences, but are rather in picture form to show you, okay, God can take the violence that has been brought upon the church and Christians and Jews, and it can fall on the heads of those that give it. This was the 7 seals, and it didn't do it. It didn't bring about the result. God's okay. Same story, many times over, third. And then when we get to the 7 bowls, it's this complete annihilation. And guess what? It still doesn't bring about the change. So when you think of our own experiences as humans, when people do exact vengeance or try to use means of violence to make recompense for violence done to us, it's the story of humanity writ large. It has not brought about the peace that we swear it will once we finally get the justice. And so what we'll find towards the end of Revelation is by the way to the Lordship of Christ and all nations seeing this and experiencing it is not through these plagues are in these torments are not how it's done. And that's the point. That is the point. In my opinion, that's my opinion. And there's healthy interpretations that don't hold that line. But that's my opinion.
When you look at Israel, and over and over and over, they'd realize they'd sin. They'd come to God. He'd forgive them. They'd be okay for a while. Then they go right back to their old ways again. Oh, just repeat it over and over and over. And then after a while, Babylon came along and they were gone for 70 years. That's another number that, appeared that said, okay, 70 years, you'll be coming back. And so I think it's just the way with the world.
You have just voiced a standard Jewish theology, which fits within Christianity too, which is that these cycles come and go, where you got a King David, an ascendance, and then a decline, and then a resurgence in another period, and a decline, and it goes like that. And so when in Jewish apocalyptic literature, they were looking for a new iteration of something that had been experienced in part in their past. Revelation goes one step further in saying we're going to bring an end to these cycles once and for all, being the primary difference.
God's going to finally say, okay, I've given up on mankind.
But
I've given them time and time again to straighten up and do right, and they keep messing up. So I'm going to take them out this time. Well, the bad people.
It's more that evil comes to a terminus where you come to a point, and this is me as a human speculating because these are bigger questions than all of us, but you can imagine a place where there's literally nothing else that can be turned over and changed, and God will know. That's the vision here. I hope for a universal salvation that is. Some find it in Revelation. I don't think that's what John envisions, although he does envision a salvation that is far larger than many around his day and age had envisioned. there's still very strong sectarian tendencies within Christianity and Judaism, specifically in preference to Judaism, because most Christians were Jewish at that time. Jesus was.
Yes, he was.
Well, so you're the only picture that's moving here. Everyone else is frozen up. Can everyone else hear me?
Yeah.
They just moved. Yeah, they're all moving.
Okay. All right.
You froze
Must
up
be
a
my
little
internet
bit
connection.
ago. So it came just a once in a while, everybody freezes.
Okay. Oh, I had meant to talk about those illustrations that I showed. I'm not going to do it every time because I think they can be too busy and too distracting. What I like about them is they don't take license with what's being described. They try to do exactly and almost too literally, almost bizarrely, picture what's happening here. So you don't get anthropomorphized angels. You just get like a wheel with a bunch of eyes, or if that's what's described or whatnot. But they are busy and they can be distracting. There are a few too. I felt like they left out in details, like a sapphire breastplate wasn't painted on the breast of the riders of those beasts. And I feel like what's implied by the riders of those beasts are human riders, because they're wearing breastplates, they're doing and that but anyway, my point is I want to show you I want to give you that that name that website. It's called apocalypseanimated.com.
Okay.
Yeah,